Okay, moving forward with the workflow where the elements are rendered, pre-rendered, and we're working with pre-rendered elements, which may have come from someone else, or we may have rendered them ourselves. I'll go over here and choose Import Multiple Files. And here is a dialog. Now, if I sort these by date modified, you can see there are several different formats and files in here. If I sort them by name as they're a little bit better organized, but unfortunately, the Adobe importer doesn't recognize them as one clip, unlike some other applications we could mention, Nuke. And so we're going to have to choose one of the images. Doesn't have to be the first one, could be number 10. Let's go with Lucky 13 and open the EXR sequence. And we get the whole thing by just choosing any one in there. We'll go down to the next one, the Shadow AO Ambient Occlusion Pass, which is a ping sequence. And then finally, right down to the bottom is this just shadow sequence. We don't know yet what these are. I'll cancel because I'm done importing. Command / to add them to the comp, and there are the 3 layers. F2 deselects. They have unwieldy names, which we can shorten. So these are the creatures themselves on this foreground pass, and they have transparency. Notice that this is an EXR sequence. It's listed in the project as floating point plus, so it is 32-bit and linear light. It's a linear sequence, but we're not going to worry about all that right now because it looks fine. It looks good. It looks like we're ready to work with it. I'm just going to actually turn it off right now, and let's focus on these shadow passes. This pass is just a contact shadow for spiky. So I'm going to rename this spiky contact, and we'll turn that one off for the moment. And then this one is floaty's cast shadow. So I'll call this floaty shadow. Now the natural thing to do would be to choose a blending mode, say multiply, and I'll unsolo it so it does something. And now the white is gone and only the black remains over the scene. And then I could, for example, adjust the opacity to get it to a matching level. That's not bad, but notice something that's happening here. There's kind of a threshold where I'm darkening the existing shadow while trying to actually match it. So the existing one is at 0.21 in my info panel. And if I try to match it, now we're at about that level here, but here we are quite a bit darker. We're down at 0.11. So let's try doing this a different way. I can leave it on multiply or not. It doesn't really matter for what I'm about to do, but I do want the opacity up all the way. And I'm going to use this as a matte with a new adjustment layer. So let's call this floaty shadow adjustment and set it via a Luma inverted matte. That's using the black as the opaque part. And then I'm going to go ahead. Let's go with curves here. So the equivalent of what I was doing before with multiply would be to just bring the black contrast upward. Instead, I chose curves because I'm going to do this with a gamma. If I gamma the whole thing down, I'm still lowering the other shadow. But if I hold out the bottom part of the curve, I can keep those levels where they are while darkening the lighter tones. And I'm going to kind of try to smooth this out. It doesn't matter if there's some ambient light creeping in because it is believable that the shadow would be darker where the object is actually casting on the ground. But I don't want as much light to kind of leak in. And mostly I'm just showing you how to take control of this and also making what I think is kind of a worthwhile point, which is a shadow really is a color adjustment. So shadows have color. And in the scene, the lighting's fairly neutral, but you could have shadows that were predominantly green, red, or blue, and doing them with a color adjustment would totally nail it in that case. All right, so that looks pretty good. We're at half res. It would look better at full. Nice. The spiky contact shadow, this one I'm happy to do just with multiply. Let's turn on that and the foreground so we can see its effect. There it is. If I flash the blacks by raising exposure, it's maybe a tinge dark, but we can just a tinge. I'm going to go with 70, and that's you know, good. I mean, it's very kind of not a thing you're focusing on. So pretty happy with that. And so now, having dialed in the shadows, the next step is going to be to match in the actual elements. So here you saw me both use an adjustment layer with the shadow as a matte to produce a shadow, and just using the layer itself with a multiplier, could have been a darken mode. And I do recommend you not forget about using adjustment layers with the layer, the reference layer as a matte, because many phenomena in nature actually can be better recreated with color adjustments. They have a lot of benefits. You get all the source grain in there, and in this case, we were able to take a little more control over the boundaries of it. But there are things you can create like moisture, rain. Rain you can do with particles, but you apply the whole thing via some adjustments that are just within the raindrops, if you can imagine that, because I'm not going to show you. It's not part of the lesson right now. I've moved these guys down in the layer stack so that they're below the logo and blur that comes on at the end. And for color matching, we can go back to half res, no big deal. And then the first thing I can see that needs to be adjusted about these foreground creatures all together is they're just too saturated. If I look at the color channels, the lighting is pretty neutral, and they look kind of equally matched or not on all three channels. So we're going to desaturate. Now, if I haven't said it before, what saturation does is pull red, green, and blue further apart if you raise it, or push them closer together if you lower it, making them grayer effectively. And that's what we want to do. So without losing too much of their vibrance, we just want them believably looking like they're part of the scene. Now, granted, you can take them the other direction if that's what you're feeling. But let's just suppose that we are concerned here with making the eye believe that they're real, and go with something like that. And then the other thing that I'd like to do is pop the highlights a little bit. We could go sort of crazy with this, but I'm just going to go with a curves and just take the top part of the curve and blow it out a bit to just kind of pop this guy here. And we could even bring these other guys back a bit more, make them more in the shadows. All right, that looks like a pretty good initial adjustment. And then I'm going to go ahead and also think about grain. So let's flash the scene for a second. You can see there is no grain on my characters, and there's not a lot of grain in the scene, but it's a little hard to see at quite that bright a level. Well, I don't know if you can see it or not, and we're at half res, so for grain matching we do need to be at full. There is a modest amount of grain. I don't know if I can zoom in enough to really see it, but you're going to see it in the threshold areas. There it is. So for that, I'll use add grain instead of match. It's a little bit faster. We always have to remember to go to final output. And at the default, it's just a little strong, but otherwise it's going to be fine for what I'm seeing in the scene. So I'm just going to lower the intensity a bit. Now the slider is very delicate because we're below 1.0 here. I think something like that is going to be good. Again, the main thing here is if there's just that ambient grain happening in the scene, we don't want our static elements to lack that. Rules, we all know, are meant to be broken. And what I'm offering you on the visual effects side is not meant to be rules as such, but guidelines that would give you a starting point of how to make things really match and be believable. And then if a motion graphics project calls for them to be less believable, less plausible, pushing the edge in one way or another, you can be controlled and selective about it. And when you get really good at it, you can imbue the element with a lot of bits of realism and nice touches so that the things that are extraordinary stand out all that much more. Wow, did I just say that? As we already know from a previous lesson, EXRs can contain multiple channels and often do. And this one does. So let's take a look at the depth channel. I'll take this layer. I'm going to remove the effects using the Remove All selection in the Effect menu and rename this Depth. Then I'm going to go to the 3D channel menu and set Extractor. And immediately it seems the image is ruined. We're not going to worry about how this pass looks right now, and we're going to go to one of the utility passes. So a utility pass is one that you wouldn't use as an image by itself. It's one that you would use to adjust an image. And there are a few of them. We're going to look at a couple. First, the depth. And you can see that what is happening here is the 3D software has helpfully figured out where things are in Z space, and the closest element is the lightest, and the furthest is the darkest. And there is a really elegant way to apply this. So I'm going to go ahead back to the main layer, and I'm going to apply a camera lens blur, but you could do this with the third-party tools like Frischluft or the camera lens blur that you can find on AE scripts. They have the feature of also letting you set a matte. So under blur map, I'll choose that depth layer. And additionally, because I set an extractor effect, I also need to choose effects and masks. And now you can see that the blur is heavier where the matte was lighter. So here the foreground spiky is blurrier than this guy in the back who is barely blurred at all if I toggle that. Now we always want the grain to be at the end of the chain. So I'm just going to move this up. And now I'm going to dial it in. So we're at full res, that's good. And you might think, oh yeah, depth of field, so I want the one in the back to be the blurriest and the one in the foreground to be the sharpest. Not necessarily, right? So that's where you got to actually study the real world or the real world of the scene and decide. And I see a lot of detail in the background. Background looks like it's in focus to me. And if anything, it is the foreground that is actually soft. So, for example, I could go to the effect and invert the blur map, and now the foreground is in sharp focus and the background is out, and clearly that's not what we want. I'll undo that, and in fact I would say that it's already matching in the back. If I go to the middle, that's a little too much blur. So I'm going to just reduce the overall amount of blur from 5. I'll just type in 3. That looks more like those two match blur-wise. And here as well, it's pretty subtle at this point, right? But if I turn it off, you can see that it is applied. And that is going to do it for that. Now, there's another adjustment I want to make to this scene. And that is to adjust these two that are in the shadows so that their saturation, I think, is lower. I could adjust their levels, but I really think it's that they're too saturated. So objects that aren't self-illuminated, like a light, are going to lose color when they go in the shadows because light is what gives you color. So let's try this out. I'm going to make another utility pass. I'll just duplicate depth and rename it holdout. And this time in the menu, I'm going to choose an object buffer. Now let's turn on this layer. In fact, object buffer 1 is the one that I want. If I solo the layer, you can see that this is giving me a grayscale selection where in white we've got the floaty McGee, I almost called him Spiky. And there's the back floaty, object buffer 2, and Spiky in object buffer 3. Now, let's just talk about these layers for a second. Think of these a little bit like the layers you would create in Photoshop, where whoever created the file has the option to put in as many or as few as that artist wants. And so any two EXR files would potentially have as many or as few and whichever channels in them that you want. There are some that are somewhat standard, and there are often artists who just kind of go with a specific set of them, and different softwares will kind of point you toward automatically getting this or that set. Anyway, in this case, we do want this object buffer. Now, we could just use a mask, but think about a situation where maybe your three characters overlap and you want to hold one of them out. Then this becomes way more useful and a big time saver. So back here, I'll turn the layer back off, and I'm going to use an adjustment layer once again. Put it below and set it via Illumimat. Now, one other note, let me just solo the layer once more. So we see white over black, but if we turn on the checkerboard, in fact, the black is only on the other objects and the rest is transparent. I'm going to use this to my advantage because I am lazy, and what I actually want is the other two objects as my matte. So one way I could get that is just to say channel invert, and now the correct ones are white and the other one black. But let's suppose I want the whole background to be black. In fact, I don't need this in this case because After Effects considers anything transparent to be the same as black when you use Illumimat. But let me just show you how this is done. So if I choose Solid Composite, now everything but floaty is white. However, if I change this just to black right here, we get the opposite. You can see a faint outline around the edges of floaty, which are its border semi-transparent areas. Like I said, I'm a little lazy, so I'm not going to worry about that. So this wasn't a necessary step, but you may find this useful. So back in the comp, I now have an adjustment layer, and this time I'm going to desaturate using the tint effect. Tint is different than hue and saturation, even though it has the same basic result, which is to remove all the color. However, tint is properly weighted toward red, green, and blue. If you've ever noticed that the blue channel tends to be darker, that's because your eye is more sensitive to blue, and so tint takes that into account. So if you're making a proper grayscale image or taking most or all of the color out of something, you want to use tint rather than hue and saturation. I'm actually going to come back quite a bit on this effect because I don't really want them to be grayscale. I think something like that looks pretty good. So we just use EXR for utility passes, and for that it's very handy because of how many different types of layers it can contain. And as you saw, we just used them using what's available in After Effects, the extractor effect, and just working otherwise in an ordinary project. Back on the trail, we're going to look at a couple of EXR renders of Spiky that we could work with. So I'll choose Import Multiple Files. And I have a couple of passes, as I said. There is the so-called Beauty Pass, that is the one that's really designed to match what we've already got and just break it down a bit more. And then there is a multi-pass, quote-unquote one, that's just a little bit crazier. The 3D artist, of course, is setting the basis for what we're going to work with. And the idea is that we take it where we want on that basis. So it's almost as if 80% of it is done in 3D, and we're doing the last 20, but we can certainly do more. I just checked the Create Composition box here. And that is going to add a second dialog box, which is special for EXR. So look closely here. We have a couple of options to pre-compose and to create a contact sheet. And I'm going to enable both of those. I'm going to go ahead and grab the other pass as well. With the same options. Okay, so what have we got? We'll look at the first one. We have an EXR sequence and a couple of comps. One's called Assemble and one's called Contact Sheet. The Assemble is going to have Spiky. It is created with the camera move, and this is, by the way, the kind of crazy one. So this is where we really lit up the tentacles and we had some fun. And what you see down here are a lot of layers. Those are the various channels of the EXR. And you can see they have really long names, they're hard to read. And to make it easier to see what's in here, I can open the contact sheet. Here we're over the checkerboard. If I go over black, some of them will appear to be invisible. So for now, checkerboard's kind of useful. And I see 19 layers there. So the same ones as we saw comped together, but now we see them individually. And we can kind of take a look at which ones catch our eye. Now, we could actually be very precise and go look at what each one is, but I'm encouraging you to have a little fun here. So rather than, oh yeah, let's look at what each one does and what it's for to start with, let's just kind of get a sense of what all's here. So I'm using the exposure tool to bring up the levels of ones that are very low light. The specular is very low, and that's just simply because the artist chose for the object not to have much specularity. Of course, these are animated, so we can also go to a different frame, and we're going to see a little bit more. So some of the layers are quite colorful. Here's a diffuse source layer, and this is created by, I think, via the bounce light that's coming from the ground, so you see it lit from underneath. So this is where you can basically do a lot of what you might have thought you could only do in 3D in 2D. So we can take this render, which is just the ambient, and that is the self-illuminated tentacles, And as you can imagine, we could pretty easily turn that into a bit of a glow. Same with this layer over here, the spike light specular source. So this is a self-illuminated set of kind of like little glistening, glowing things out there. So there's some fun stuff to play with here. And then some of the layers are clearly not meant to be in the image itself, but rather to be reference for the image. So for example here, it'd probably be better if I just made the timeline a little taller. So the shadow source, shadows, as we've already seen, are generally done with a multiply mode. Now if I look back in the assemble comp, the shadow and all the other passes are set to normal. So that's actually a flaw to how this is done. Really, the passes that are reference or at least not meant to be directly part of the image, i.e. should be applied with a multiply or darken mode, probably should have blending mode set to them. So we'll get into kind of how to start setting this up. In fact, I think we'll do that with the other one. So having looked at this fanciful one with lots of passes, let's take a look at the other one. So here's the assemble. It looks a lot like what we were already working with. And that is the intention. Now, one thing one can get hung up on when working here, and especially as we get into linear light, is does it look right? Well, remember, first of all, that with an imaginary creature, right is arbitrary. In fact, right is arbitrary with a human being. As compositors, we're just trying to make it look good and bring it to life. And this is giving us some extra ability to do so. So don't get too hung up on whether this version exactly matches the 8-bit version that you could just render out in one pass. At least not while we're just having fun. So here is a context sheet with the passes for this guy, and they're quite a bit more straightforward. You see a couple of them, again, that are clearly reference passes, and you see a couple that seem to be quite dark. You have to go way up. Again, the specular is very low, and this guy over here, the reflection's also very low. So actually, things are kind of making sense. This guy that's yellow is a motion vector source. We probably don't need that. It could be used with certain types of software to actually add things like motion blur. Multipass rendering goes all the way back to the days of the earliest motion control cameras. And really, Star Wars was the big innovator of this technology. So if you just think about what a spaceship would require, a simple beauty pass, a single pass, wouldn't really do it. Think about it. It's on a lit stage. It's got bright lights on it, so you get all the detail of the exterior looking good. But what that doesn't give you is any self-illumination. So for example, if the cockpit is illuminated and has a pilot staring at a screen, that would be a separate pass, as would any flack, any brightness, any explosions, any interactive lighting that's happening. And you might indeed also get, say, a shadow pass, just so that you could dial in different shading rather than having to just nail everything in the beauty pass. And that actually still really applies in that it's pretty rare that you can see everything properly and adjusted in your 3D renderer or your 3D animation software without basically rendering way too much. So the idea, it's a little bit of, if you've ever heard of the 80-20 rule, is get it 80% there and then just get the rest of it done in comp. Back here in the assemble for our more plain spiky, you might assume that your job is to use all of these layers to correctly composite this character. Let's just abandon that assumption right now, because this is a case where a lot of these passes aren't really all that great or all that useful. As I said, the amount of specularity and reflection on this character is not that high. There's some reflection in the tentacle there, but maybe I'm already happy with it. So let's just take a look at something I would like to work with, which is ambient occlusion. And before I do that, let me actually turn off the checkerboard. And let's just take a look here for a second. So right now we're just looking at the RGBA, which is blocking all the other layers because they are also set to normal mode and just sitting behind it with the same transparency. However, if I solo RGBA, the white lines around the edges go away. And that's just kind of an error with how this otherwise great automatic setup works, because this ambient occlusion pass, for example, should not be showing up in normal mode behind RGBA. All it's doing is creating a matte line. So really, all I have to do is turn it off and the matte line's gone. So little things like that will really discourage people from getting in here. But let's see what we can do with just these two layers. I'm going to move ambient occlusion up to the top. And again, instead of using a blending mode, let me turn off all the other layers. I'm going to apply it with an adjustment layer. And let's call this AO. Move it below. And we want the dark parts. So that's going to be a Luma inverted matte. And now what I can do with the levels effect is, for example, if I want his gills to feel super red, I can lift the red output black. Red output black, that's a little not intuitive to say. And notice I could even create this thing where I animate them kind of pulsing. And maybe I even go back to that thing of going around the hue wheel, and that will be the extent of my craziness on this particular pass. So let's do that. I will animate the levels, and to do that, let's get rid of the levels effect and go instead to levels, individual controls. If you've ever seen this one and wondered what it's for, it is for animation. Now each channel has its own keyframeable set of controls. So if I go back to the red output black and raise it, I need to be on red though. Now I'm adjusting just that. What I'm going to do is let's set it somewhere in the middle. And I'm going to hold down the Option key and the stopwatch. And you guessed it, we're going to use an expression that we've already used. So under Property, we're going to wiggle it just a little bit. Remember, the only two arguments that matter are frequency and amplitude, the first two. The rest, you can just let them be the default. So frequency is going to be 0.5, so 1 every 2 seconds. Pretty gentle amount of wiggle. And the amount, boy, I'm going to say 0.15. Let's see what that does. Remember, we're working on the scale of 0 to 1 here. So let's preview that. And for this, I can go half res and every other frame. It does look grainy, but that's what you get when you go to a lower resolution. Can't really see anything happening yet, although I do see it getting more pronounced there, fading back again. Here it comes again. Let's take a look. Yeah, it's just kind of gently pulsating thing is going on. What I'd really like it to do is change color. For that, I'm going to pull out another variation on one of our standard color correction effects that also is designed for animation. Color balance HLS is like hue and saturation with individual properties that you can keyframe. So once again, option click on the stopwatch. This time, I'm going to use time to animate the control, and I'm going to go time times, let's say, 60. And there you see the shift. Let's check that out. Ooh. All right, so ask yourself, how long would it take to go back to 3D and do this versus just dialing this in comp? So that was a great example of the kind of thing you can easily come up with in 2D and pretty effortlessly put into play. I was just looking at the element, I saw the ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion passes are really cool. You can make whole motion graphic designs out of them. But I saw some potential to give this thing a little bit of that extra otherworldly quality by just bringing this thing to life. I do this not to impress you, but to inspire you to come up with something even better in your own shots for this exercise coming up. Keeping in mind that we are still in a 16-bit per channel project, I'll go back to the trail shot, and let's just see what happens if we swap in our spiky trail creature assemble that we've just been working on, and we could give it a more intuitive name, but there we are. Apparently this one was positioned a little differently, which is okay. And again, we'll just do a half-res preview. And that's cool. It's looking too desaturated, so we'll just fix that. Let me turn off hue and saturation. Okay, so I'm just going to come back to where I was initially with this adjustment. All right, well, supposing we were happy with that one, we still need to deal with integration with the scene, specifically at the base. I'm going to put this to the test by inserting it in the comp. So go to the trail comp, select our previous spike, which is still the live Cinema 4D element, and replace it with this assemble comp, which I think I'll just call spiky trail creature. The positioning was a little different, and this one is not saturated the way the straight rendered one was. So in fact, I can kill my hue and saturation adjustment, or at least dial it way back. And it would be kind of nice if spiky was right next to this dark spot that's already in the trail. So happens, because it's a nodal pan and the camera doesn't move on this camera track, that I could actually put spiky right there. As you may recall, when I was putting together this scene, and I'll just solo one of the EXR layers, when I set extractor, and I don't need solid composite anymore, everything looked dark. Now, this is one of the ways that you could inadvertently end up switching midstream as far as After Effects is concerned. So when we brought in the EXR footage, it all looks fine because After Effects sees you are working low dynamic range and you have no color profile applied. So it goes, okay, I'll just call it sRGB and make it look good for you. But now that we've applied extractor, it goes, oh, I guess you want to work linear now. And so it's showing you linear footage with no gamma. And no gamma makes it darker. Now, if that's all gobbledygook, don't worry. I'm just going to show you the fix in case this ever happens to you. So there's an effect called utility. Well, it's not called utility, it's called color profile converter. And all I'm going to do is check linearize input profile, and this is now doing the same thing that After Effects was doing for me behind the scenes previously. So this is a quick fix. Now, I really don't recommend you rely too heavily on color profile converter. It's a pain to be chasing around color profiles using a plugin, after all. It is more of an in case of emergency break glass kind of thing if you ever find that you're just stuck and you don't know how else to solve it. Stepping back for a second, if you don't know why the image looked like that, I'm going to try to state it as simply as possible. In the very first lesson in the course, I explained a little bit about how your monitor and all the images have gammas applied to them, and that makes them look right to your eye. But in fact, middle gray and linear light behave differently. Middle gray is well below the actual 50% gray on images on your monitor. And so linear light is mimicking the way light behaves in the world. And so with linear light, if you double the value, you get double the amount of light. If you do that with images that have a gamma applied, they get considerably brighter. And whether you've noticed or not, we're compensating for this all the time. So while your monitor lies to you and applies a gamma, linear light is behind the scenes using true light values. And as you can imagine, that has a lot of advantages, especially when you couple it with high dynamic range so that you can easily push values over range of what your monitor can display and then bring them back in range and so on. Now we're going to have some fun. I went into the contact sheet and found the layers that I want to work with, the ones that kind of caught my eye. And then I chose those in the Assemble edit and made those the visible ones and shied all the rest of them, so they're still there if I need them. And we're going to get to work just seeing what's possible with these layers. In fact, I'm going to wait for a second. What I see here is a lot of nice texture from the top lighting. So I thought that looked interesting, but we'll just save that one until later. Keeping the exposure down for now. This guy also for later, although the ones that are lighting things up, I'm going to move up. So these two are going to be with add modes over the RGB. And this one as well. And then this one, of course, is going to be darkening the RGB. So this time around, let's just build this up. All right, so I can multiply that in there, maybe dial it back a bit for now. And then the next layer is going to be with an add mode. And what I'd like to do here is change the color, specifically the hue of it. And so, again, imagine how difficult this would be to do in multiple 3D rendering passes and how easy it is to do here. And I can make it, you know, whatever color I want, but I'm thinking something like that. And I'm going to leave it just as is and keep going. All right, this again is going to be with an add mode. Now here's where I'm going to call a timeout. You know by now, or if you don't, I'm going to lay it out for you clearly, that
the basic rule in multipass compositing, as it's done in a standard way, is on any pass you're going to pretty much use it in 3 different ways. If it's a light pass, you're going to use add mode. If it's a darken pass, a shadow and what have you, you're going to multiply it, or perhaps darken, but probably multiply. And if it's a pass that's designed to have some utility, you're going to use it as design. So we've looked at object buffers, depth passes. We took a brief look at a motion vector pass, even though we're not covering how to use that, but you could easily learn to do so. Now, there's more to multipass compositing than that, but let's just say that that's going to get you most of what you would need to know to set this up. And that's only if you're doing it the standard way. Now, we're going to take beginner's mind, because as compositors and artists, but also motion graphics artists, we're really interested in making discoveries and going with kind of what speaks to us in the imagery that we've got. So now I'm going to move forward in that spirit.
In the spirit of beginner's mind, I'm just taking a step back now, and everything looks really bright. I don't think I want my spiky guy to get any brighter, even though I could dial him back down. So even though this is a light pass, I'm going to overlay it, because what I really want is more of the texture on there, and I got a little bit. If we look at this layer, it's very, very faint. I could, of course, boost it up, but I've got other layers I can throw into the mix. So let's see what those do. So here's another lighting pass, and it's meant to be the top light from the sun. Once again, let's see what happens if I overlay this. So this is working with a threshold to both lighten and darken, and then I can further adjust it. And in this case, my adjustment would probably be with an opacity, because it just looks a bit strong. I'll just toggle it on and off. So you can see that I'm getting my desired result of bringing out the texture. The stem is getting a little dark, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. I'm mostly focused on the look here on top, and I'm really starting to like it. We've got one more pass that I haven't done anything with. Let's see what this one is. So this one is very saturated color. It is a background pass. Now, I believe that's like the backlighting. However, I don't even care, because I'm just gonna look at this, again, beginner's mind, and go, okay, I see saturation. And again, motion graphics perspective and having fun. If I want saturation to play a part in this, what I want to do is actually use maybe a color transfer, or since that got rid of those nice pink highlights that I had in there, instead I'm going to go with luminosity, or actually let's go with saturation, because it's very saturated. Yeah, that's it. So using saturation basically is saying where this layer is saturated, I want that saturation underneath it. So it's adding more saturation to the model beneath. And I don't know, I kind of like it. Let's call this my first pass at spiking. And we're only going to get to the first pass here. I am opening the door for you to take a bunch of these layers and create art with them. So I'm going to go grab myself an EXR sequence, stick it at the top. Again, this is a safety, just stencil the alpha. And then over here on the trail, I'm just going to paste in the color correction that we did much earlier from that gradient adjustment. I have it on my pasteboard. And that basically looks like it's going in the right direction. I would look at whether I could lift the dark areas even a bit more And to compensate for that, what I might do is throw on a curves control. He is really, really saturated, so I could also throw a hue and saturation for a minor adjustment or tint for a major one. I'm going to go with minor. Let's just go just a hint back here. And heck, I might actually, I don't know. This is the kind of thing where I would probably walk away, come back, go, oh, now he looks way too muted. I really want to get back to what I saw over here, and figure out how to make that work. Possibly add some glows, integrate the bottom better, maybe get a little more color back into the stock. So there's more to do, but this is just a little exercise in working with multiple passes without worrying about what's quote unquote correct.
All right, that was a long diatribe, but I want you at the end of the day to have fun with this, and I think you can do a lot with EXRs and multipass compositing. More power to you.
Ah.